B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Tuesday, April 2nd, 2019. My big question to lead the podcast with today: why does Donald Trump hate Puerto Rico? And why is he trying to pit Midwestern farmers against the people on the island Commonwealth who were devastated by Hurricane Maria in 2017? So in the Senate, there is a battle over funding for disaster relief. And I am reading the coverage here, and I don't see anything about the California wildfires and disaster relief for the Golden State. The battle is pitted between the Midwestern farmers whose crops and lands have been inundated, in some cases for weeks now. And it is a serious disaster. And from here on the left coast, I fully support necessary funding for every part of the nation, including Puerto Rico, that has suffered extreme weather events and the related carnage in recent years. And because Washington is spending like drunken sailors. Nobody accounts for the $1.5 trillion cost of the corporate tax cuts. And the Republicans, who are such deficit hawks when there is a Democrat in the White House or Democrats are in control of either house of Congress, they just are hitting the credit card like there's no tomorrow. And so this becomes a petty squabble. It's not about the money. It's about Trump's idea of whether Puerto Rico is worthy. And he deploys lies. He was madly tweeting late into the night last night. And his message is that Democrats want to steal money from Trump's base in the Midwest to give to those undeserving, and yes, we can call them mostly brown, Puerto Ricans. There is a racial component to this, like so much of what Trump cares about, what activates him. So the Senate did not pass a $13.5 billion emergency aid bill. Democrats balked as Republicans were only willing to authorize $600 million to extend food stamps, it's called SNAP now, food stamp money for Puerto Rico. So Trump responds with what is accurately described by Greg Sargent at the Washington Post with an unusually disgusting and hateful series of tweets. He claimed that Puerto Rico has already gotten $91 billion in aid, and that is a flat-out lie. The number is less than $20 billion, and not all of that money has been delivered or spent. Now, this gets into the weeds of the politics of the debate in the Senate, but Trump is trying to spin this, that Midwest farmers would be shortchanged if the money is given to Puerto Rico. Now, nobody is saying that there is a limit on how much can be spent on disaster relief, and therefore these difficult choices like Betsy DeVos was faced with last week in trying to cut funding for the Special Olympics. There is no issue, at least not that is being acknowledged. So Trump went on to hate tweet that the people who run Puerto Rico, its governor and the mayor of San Juan, are either corrupt or incompetent, grossly incompetent, and therefore we cannot give them any more money. And we know that in 2017, we had Hurricane Maria, we had hurricanes that hit Florida, we had Harvey that devastated Houston and the Gulf Coast. And in the original disaster relief funding, there was more money for Florida and Texas than there was for Puerto Rico, despite the requests that came in from our island Commonwealth. And Trump treats Puerto Rico like it belongs to some other country, He said that the Puerto Rico politicians only take from the USA. So this is fundamentally ugly and unfair. It is racist. And it is some of the most base politics that's been exposed since, last week, I would say. And returning to Greg Sargent's narrative here in the Post, this is why Trump needs to flagrantly distort the underlying dispute by claiming both that Puerto Rico is undeserving of the aid money that Democrats want to give it, and that in doing so, Democrats would take money from Midwesterners, both of which are based on lies. And he concludes, we don't know for sure if Trump believes his latest attacks on Puerto Rico will please his base. But given that he's telling rural voters in a region that he needs in 2020 that Puerto Rican disaster sufferers do not deserve any more help, and that such help would take from them, it seems like a reasonable assumption. And then there were more tweets. This is when he attacked San Juan's Mayor Carmen Yulin Cruz, who is a really strong and impressive woman who led her nation, see what I did there? Led Puerto Rico and her city after the devastation in a way that I find admirable. And she has stood up to Trump before. Her weak-kneed governor, whose name is Ricardo Rossello, he has lately gotten a little tougher on Trump. I mentioned it the other day that he's no longer kissing the golden comb-over's butt. So here's how Trump attacked the mayor of San Juan. FEMA and the military worked emergency miracles, but politicians like the crazed and incompetent mayor of San Juan have done such a poor job of bringing the island back to health. $91 billion to Puerto Rico, and now the Dems want to give them more, taking dollars away from our farmers and so many others. Disgraceful. Well, let's remember that the mayor of San Juan, Cruz, is considered by Trump to be crazed and incompetent because she challenged his bullshit when he came to the island and tossed out paper towels and acted like just by gracing them with his presence that everything was going to be okay. So Cruz hit back on the tweeter machine. President Trump continues to embarrass himself in the office he holds. He is unhinged and lies about the money received by Puerto Rico. He knows his response was inefficient at best. He can huff and puff all he wants, but he cannot escape the death of 3,000 on his watch. Shame on you. And then Rossello, getting his gusto on, said, Mr. President, this place you refer to, Puerto Rico, is home to over 3 million proud Americans who are still recovering from the storm and in need of federal assistance. We are not your adversaries. We are your citizens. And because of the extreme weather events, and in particular the Midwest flooding, USA Today, in an unusually long article, 8 pages, which was published last week, they write about houses on stilts, floating buildings, more parks to absorb water, better maps to warn those at risk. And they're talking about the blueprints that are laid out in the book that Vanessa Keith and her team published just a few months ago. The book is called 2100, A Dystopian Utopia. And USA Today describes it as a book that envisions what cities will look like after climate change. Low-lying and coastal cities have been destroyed by rising sea levels and storm surge. Inland towns struggle with droughts and wildfires. Global megacities have become more compact and are almost completely rebuilt to deal with new norms. That is what is depicted in this book. And Vanessa Keith and her publisher have been kind enough to donate a stack of copies. And this is a richly published book. I mean, the production in it, the color graphics are really impressive. And it retails for, I believe, $55. It is now on the list of bonus books that you can get if you sign up for a new annual subscription to the Peter B. Collins podcast and provide a mailing address in the continental U.S. I would love to send you a copy of this book for your new annual subscription, and I think you'll find it very impressive. And it does offer a path forward. There are many people who are kind of accepting that climate change has cooked the planet, and that it's just a matter of time until first animal and then possible human extinction approaches. And Vanessa Keith's an architect, an acclaimed one. She and her team have put together actual blueprints for the year 2100 following a 4-degree Celsius increase in the planet's temperature. I think you'll find it fascinating. I'd love to send you a copy. And today I want to thank Don Cisney and his brother John at Cambridge. John, your bonus book is on the way, by the way. Also, Jeff Lipinski, Paul Lacombe, and the folks at DGL. They all support me with monthly contributions, and you can do the same. All you have to do is visit peterbcollins.com, click on menu, click on Become a Subscriber. You hit the sign-up page. It's easy to choose $5, $10, $20 a month. The $50 annual gets the bonus book sent to you. And if you don't like PayPal, you can always use the U.S. mail. My P.O. Box is number 150660, San Rafael, California, 94915. Well, last week, Trump stepped on his own winning moment. He is able to claim, not accurately, but exoneration from everything Robert Mueller ever dreamed of. And he stepped on his own moment by announcing that he was backing the lawsuit that would totally end Obamacare. And in the next breath, he surprised all of his Republican members on the Hill by saying that the Republicans were going to become the party of really great health care. Now, they don't have a clue of what they would replace Obamacare with. And after it kind of ping-ponged back and forth, Mitch McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader, said he'd love to see what Trump has in mind. Send it on over. Then Trump said, no, that's Congress's job. You guys put a bill together, and I'll put my big fat signature on it. Well, in the last few days, Mitch McConnell had some tough talk with the Donald, and he basically said, no way. Not going to happen before the election because it would deal certain defeat to Republican senators up for election in 20. So Trump has now said that his party will not come up with its own health care plan until after next year's election. Here's the tweet. The Republicans are developing a really great health care plan with far lower premiums and deductibles than Obamacare. In other words, it'll be far less expensive and much more usable than Obamacare. Vote will be taken right after the election when Republicans hold the Senate and win back the House. Wow. Now, that is pie in the sky. And I welcome this because I think it creates the opening for Medicare for all. It's clear the Republicans aren't going to show us anything until 2021, if at all. And I think Sanders, with many of his cohorts who are running for president, who've signed on at least to the concept of Medicare for all, I think this is the time to drive it home. And the necessary component to overcome the critics who say it's too expensive, they've got to link it to cuts in defense spending. That, to me, is the winning formula. I hope they're all listening because my advice is free, like this podcast. Well, the Crown Prince, Jared Kushner, went on to a hostile media platform the other night, Fox News. It was actually last night. He dismissed concerns raised by the whistleblower who said that he is likely among 25 White House officials who were initially turned down for security clearances, and then those determinations were overturned by people higher up. And Kushner just dismissed it. He said, well, since he volunteered for Trump's administration, he's faced a lot of crazy accusations during the past 2 years. And here's his non-answer. I can say over the last 2 years I've been here, I've been accused of all types of things, and all of those things have turned out to be false. Really, Jared? We've had a lot of crazy accusations, like that we colluded with Russia. Now, this is the problem that I've been predicting. He is able to persuade the base of Trump's supporters that because Mueller came up with no evidence of the Russian collusion, that everything else that's been alleged against the administration, and even in particular Jared and Ivanka, is necessarily false. And I'm sorry to say that that approach is likely to be persuasive to the Trumpers. Now, the White House is desperately trying to get Stephen Moore over the hump to get him confirmed as a nominee for the Federal Reserve Board. And he is an economist who has a really checkered history. They just sealed up the court documents from his divorce after we learned that he had been behind $300,000 in alimony and child support. He owes taxes. He was fired from the Wall Street Journal. And he is described as somebody who doesn't have the proper temperament to serve as a Federal Reserve director. Perfect nominee from Trump's point of view. Now to news from Venezuela. And again, I credit Whitney Webb, a great reporter who writes for Mint Press News, and she tells us that Juan Guaido, the self-proclaimed interim president of Venezuela, has announced new tactical actions taken by his supporters starting on April 6 as part of Operation Freedom. And that will be led by Freedom and Aid committees that in turn create freedom cells throughout the country, cells that will spring to action when Guaido gives the signal on April 6th and launches large-scale community protests. Now, if this sounds familiar, it's because it is from a playbook released by the United States Agency for International Development, USAID, and they did that just 2 months ago. And the details include creating these cells, and this is common in any kind of insurgency or revolutionary movement. The difference here is that this is the action plan of the Trump administration and the U.S. government. And it's not just, unarmed protesters who are demanding demanding to be heard. The mobilization techniques include weapons handling and use. So we're knee-deep in this. And today, I am releasing an in-depth interview with Dan Kovalik. Dan is a fascinating guy. He's a labor lawyer from Pittsburgh. He served as a volunteer election monitor in Venezuela last year and reports that the election was not tainted in the manner that the U.S. media and politicians routinely report without any proof. And in this excerpt from our conversation, he talks about the racial component, that the white European elitists are in the minority in Venezuela, and they are trying to recover their control that was upended by Hugo Chavez in 1999. Here's Dan Kovalik.
So I think it is very important to understand the racial issues in Venezuela, which are not dissimilar to those in our country, well, except with one big exception. Here you talk about racial minorities being oppressed. In Venezuela, the truth is that it is the lighter-skinned European Venezuelans who are the minority. And the majority really are Afro-descendants and mestizos and indigenous people all combined. So people of color are actually the vast majority of the Venezuelan people, but they haven't been treated as such before Chavez. They really were oppressed people. They really were people who were invisible in society, who did not count.
That's author and activist Dan Kovalik. Our in-depth interview is being released today to subscribers at peterbcollins.com, at TuneIn, iTunes, Spreaker, and Stitcher. The conversation runs about an hour, and it is focused on his new book called The Plot to Control the World, How the U.S. Spent Billions to Change the Outcome of Elections in Other Countries. We talk about Russiagate because Dan was one of the first to publish a book expressing his skepticism about the intelligence community's Russiagate narrative. We also talk in depth about Venezuela. He was just there last week. In fact, we tried to set up a Skype connection with him in Caracas last week, but because of the power outages, that didn't work out. We also talk about the perverse American policies, historically and in the present day, that impacted the nations of Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala, the major source of the migrants who upset Trump so much. I think you'll find it really enriching and fascinating. I always learn stuff when I talk to Dan Kovalik, and the interview is available for you now. Also relating to Venezuela and other countries, including Mexico. Latin American nations and their legal beagles are looking hard at the legal concept that was developed late in the George W. Bush administration in a conference at the West Point Military Academy. The West Point group hammered out a set of principles, including the concept of a nation that can be intervened with because they are described as unwilling or unable to use force against terrorist groups or to otherwise do the bidding of bigger nations like the United States. And one example is the way the Obama administration openly violated the sovereignty of the nation of Pakistan. And they wrote a memo justifying the raid on Osama bin Laden's compound in Abbottabad in 2011 because they claimed that Pakistan was unwilling or unable to deal with bin Laden itself. That's a very dangerous legal concept, and I hope those nations are effective in countering it. A couple of days ago, I read an interesting piece in the New York Times. They have an occasional columnist named Max Fisher, and they call his column The Interpreter. And he makes a number of good points based on the negative votes in the Parliament against all of the Brexit proposals that have been brought before them.
My name is no. My sign is no. My number is no.
He said that in Britain, when asked if they oppose Brexit, people will say no to Prime Minister Theresa May's deal, no to leaving the European Union without a deal, no to remoaners, as tabloids call those, who want to stay in the European Union. They say no to Theresa May. They say no to her rival Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn. And this is a virus that has spread across the world. We feel it here in our country today, where we see the most powerful political alliances are developed around blocking somebody else's proposal. Nobody has to come up with a better one. It's just stopping your opponent. And we have a couple of quotes here. This trend, driven by social change, economic upheaval, and technological disruption, is worsening some of democracy's gravest problems. It is feeding partisanship's rancor and intransigence as voters organize around opposing the other side. It is deepening instability with elections that fracture parties and eject whoever holds power. And it is driving populist revolts as citizens clamor to tear down establishments and status quos. Across Europe, mainstream parties have splintered, weakening centrist leaders and empowering hardline populists. In the U.S., all-out partisan warfare has made cooperative governance unthinkable. The trend is captured best by France's yellow vest protesters, who can agree only on their anger at the status quo and distrust of institutions. Their tear-it-all-down ethos has left them, despite their impressive power to mobilize, politically inchoate. I've linked to Max Fisher's piece and invite you to read it. I think it's pretty thought-provoking. Bill Ayers, you remember him? He and his wife, Bernadette Dorn, they were weather underground activists. They were kind of plucked out of obscurity when Sarah Palin said that Barack Obama had been palling around with Bill Ayers. Well, I've interviewed him and Bernadette a couple of times. Is it Bernardine? Bernardine. I'd have to look it up. Anyway, I find them fascinating and interesting people, and Bill Ayers is a member of the International Studies Association. Next week, they're holding their conference in Canada. And many American lefties are not allowed to attend because they cannot get a visa from Canada. Now, we need to find out much more about what level of collusion there is between the U.S. government and the Trudeau administration. It's not Pierre, it's Justin. I've gotten that straightened out. Anyway, I find this interesting because in the past, this international group of professors have met in other countries. And when they have met in the United States, they've had problems because of U.S. immigration blocking individuals from Muslim-majority countries. So they went to Canada, expecting to be welcomed with open arms and bottles of maple syrup, maybe even a little Canadian club. And they were told, stay home. At the Googleplex, just, 40 miles from me here in California, 900 Google employees who have full-time jobs, and those people get paid in six figures, almost all of them. They have signed a letter objecting to Google's treatment of temporary contractors. Now, we've talked about this before. More than half of Google's employees are temps, vendors, and contractors, and they call them TVCs. There was a David Bowie song, TVC 15. So in March, Google abruptly shortened the contracts of 34 temp workers who have been developing the personality for the Google Assistant. That's their copy of Alexa that tells you the weather and will tell you a joke if you ask it. And this has reinvigorated the debate over Google's extensive use of the TVCs. I'd love to see a little organizing for unions. But the way this is set up, the TVCs are hired by staffing agencies who contract them out to Google. And as we reported previously, Google tells their full-time employees, don't even give these TVCs a Google mug or a Google t-shirt, because that could be offering support that opens up the company to legal liability. And so they treat these people like serfs. And it's being noticed even by the well-paid full-time staff at Google. So there's a lot of controversy about Joe Biden and whether he touched the politician Lucy, I'm sorry, I don't have Lucy's name in front of me, from Nevada. And when House Speaker Nancy Pelosi was asked about Joe Biden and he's overly affectionate, she says, just pretend you have a cold and I have a cold. Join the straight arm club with me, she said. Now, Joe Biden, she says, is an affectionate person to children, to seniors, to everyone, but that's just not the way. Now, she said, I don't think it's disqualifying. He has to understand in the world that we're in now that people's space is important to them, and what's important is how they receive it, not necessarily how you intended it. And forgive me, it's Lucy Flores who broke this story last week. Now, Amy Lapos, a Connecticut woman, says that she got an unwanted, said that he grabbed her head and rubbed her nose with his nose. She was relieved that he didn't try to kiss her on the lips. Now, this is one of those cases where I don't think that these incidents are fully disqualifying. But when you look at the history of creepy behavior by Joe Biden, this is a guy who doesn't know boundaries. He has issues with self-control. And I think that those are important factors in evaluating him as a presidential candidate. Do you remember 2 months ago, the nation, we were all focused on Virginia, where Governor Ralph Northam was exposed for having a yearbook picture in blackface? And then the scandal expanded to the lieutenant governor, an African American who was accused of sexual assault by 2 women. And then the attorney general admitted that he too had a picture out there of himself in blackface. And the New York Times quotes a librarian in Richmond, Natalie Draper. Well, it just went poof. It's like it never happened. So today, Ralph Northam is still the governor. He recently appeared at a kind of a ribbon-cutting ceremony for an African-American hero of the Commonwealth of Virginia. The Lieutenant Governor, Justin Fairfax, is still in office. He shows up at public events and defends himself as a victim of lynching. The Attorney General, Mark Herring, has taken a few public events, but he's basically been invisible. And all three of them still hold office today. Couple of quick stories. The DEA has been exposed for violating the law by collecting information on people who buy a legal product, money counting machines. The DEA issued a very broad warrant in 2008 to the companies that sell these machines. The subpoenas involved no court oversight, were not pegged to any particular investigation. That is what we call extra legal. And I hope they stop the practice very soon. The Trump administration has lost what is estimated to be its 40th environmental case in a federal court when an Alaska federal judge issued an order blocking the licenses for oil and gas drilling in the Arctic and parts of the North Atlantic coast. She wrote in an April 2017 executive order by Trump revoking the drilling ban is unlawful as it exceeded the president's authority. And finally today we say goodbye to Ranking Roger. He was a vocalist for the English Beat, also did solo work, and joined Dave Wakeling from the Beat to form General Public. He was only 56. He brought ska into rock and roll in the late 1970s, early 80s. And I got to meet the lads at a radio station interview one time. Ranking Roger was a real gentleman with a great sense of humor. He and his music will be missed. Thanks for joining me today for my News and Comment podcast. We give it away free every day of the week, and I encourage you to share it far and wide. You'll find it on YouTube. I'm still Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails.